Now, my pleasure to hand over to Sir Denis for his concluding remarks.
Thank you very much. I've been asked by the trustees to say a few words at the end of the conference, so I'd like to begin really by just saying a word or two about the trustees themselves. NAP is quite a small charity, and it's got quite a small body of trustees, and I think we all in this room today need to acknowledge the responsibility they have. They're responsible for the whole thing under charity law, and also the enormous amount of work that they do around the year when we're not with them at this conference. And I think that NAP has had one of the most successful years it has ever had. It's made more contacts, it's got into more other organizations, it's really put the patient's voice on the map, I think. And in particular, the trustees and, of course, our president took a bit of a chance by allying with the Royal College of General Practitioners on a big national campaign putting patients first. It had its risks. It has, in fact, worked out remarkably well, and it has delivered the forward view, which Dr. Kempel talked about, and I'll say a few words about. So I think it's been a very good year, and at this very moment, the latest edition of the British Journal of General Practice, which is probably the most important academic journal for us as patients concerned with general practice, has an important letter from our president in it, raising some questions about the policy of triaging when we ring our practices and ask for an appointment, and it's handled on the telephone. But not a simple issue at all, and that's an important letter. Now, today we started with the president of the Royal College of General Practitioners, the new one, Dr. Terry Kempel, and he reminded us that there are really now 4 health services in the United Kingdom, because health is a devolved function, so it's running and drifting separately in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland from the English version that we here know best. And he gave his talk really against a background of crisis, a crisis as he saw it in general practice. And he gave several examples of the pressure that a very large number of GPs sort of feel they're under, including a real shortage of GPs themselves. He believes the GP Forward View is exceptionally important, and that it has and will deliver more resources to general practice than at any time since the 1960s, but phased over several years right up to 2020. He then went into an interesting and complex subject of over-investigation and treatment. This is an American idea which came from leading American doctors who introduced a campaign called Choosing Wisely. That is for patients and for doctors to choose more wisely exactly what tests and what treatments to have. And it's been adopted in this country by the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges, and it's now rolling out across the profession. But essentially, the essence is that some of the tests and some of the treatments are not always necessary, and some of them are causing adverse effects. He gave 4 principles for us, that the health care in all countries should be focused on providing the best care and the best experience for the individual patient. That's us when we go. There should always be a system of improving the health of the population. That in this era across the world there are financial problems about health services, and that therefore there should be cost awareness and cost control. And then he introduced the 4th one, which has again come an American idea, that in fact with the pressure on frontline professionals, the 4th principle should be support and make sure that they don't get burnt out or worn out, particularly when one study in Britain has suggested that 1/3 of GPs in Essex are actually burnt out on an objective measure. He reminded us of the Commonwealth Fund of New York, and at a time when things are pretty difficult, that's a reference we all need to have in mind, because this was a survey of about 10 health services across the world run by a big charity in New York, and it concluded that the NHS was the most equitable system in the world, and that in many ways the NHS was the best system available amongst all the countries that they studied. So that was the good news. And he wanted then to try to look at some of the specific examples, going back to his investigation issue, and he gave us a series of tables, which I admit I couldn't follow all at the time, but he gave particular emphasis on the epidemiological principle of the number needed to treat. The number needed to treat is the number of people who need to take a treatment of any kind to benefit, out of a proportion of all the people who take it. It's a well-known, old established epidemiological principle. It's taught to all medical students. And he thought, and I agree entirely, it's highly relevant to patients, and he encouraged us as patients to learn the NNT, the number needed to treat, of the main medications that we're all taking. There is a danger that if you take this too far, it becomes somewhat nihilistic, and you almost start wondering if we should have any tests or any investigations. So I think I just want to balance that by saying that on the very simple things like blood pressure, for example, it's been known now for 50 years that if we have high blood pressure and we don't know it, we are at risk of stroke. There's very good research evidence that if blood pressure is found and treated by a GP, the risk of stroke falls hugely. So that these simple things are still true. What I think he's doing is asking us to be more informed, to be more analytical about what we're doing as patients. We then moved on to Professor Julian Mayer from the City University in London, who was an absolutely passionate advocate for her subject, which was the care of people in care homes. It was fairly easy to see why she's been recently awarded a CBE, because this is a commitment of considerable effect. And she presented her talk in three parts. First of all, she gave us lots of facts, reminding us that there are 18,000 different care homes, there are more beds in them than the whole of the NHS, 3 times over, and that 90% are in independent hands, and 40% of the patients in care homes are paying for themselves, which is a fact that's very little known. And she then went on to look at the policy issues, which were really very disturbing. Real problems about the resources, that a lot of local authorities are now paying homes less than the cost of the care in the home, and they are therefore charging the fee-paying self-care people more than they need to balance the books. A really awkward and uncomfortable policy. Real problems of training, real problems of standards, and real worry about some of the CQC reports. She kept repeating that the variety is enormous, from two beds to 200, and that it's very important that we don't overgeneralize and try to draw simple conclusions which are not available, in her view, on the data that she's got. And she then finished by talking about the organisation My Home, which is actually an initiative she's built up, which is rolling out in England and in Wales, and which, as she was very proud to tell us, now had a mention in the government white paper. And she summarised by saying the issue is to get the research, the education and the practice all integrated together. Mr. Raj Adgopal came to us as a real innovator, someone who's really broken the mould, and talked to us as a male health visitor. And he was particularly interested, as somebody who's come from India in the 21st century, as an immigrant here, to be aware of the needs of immigrants and how best to help them. Interesting challenge, because many people come to this country from systems that don't even have general practices as we know them, and so the background is expectation of different ways of doing things, particularly doing everything in hospital. And so he has got up the idea of developing a new app, which he spoke to us about, and the purpose of the app is to make it very easy for immigrants to obtain information and to be advised and guided. And his particular variation is different from other approaches, which is he envisages a moderator who will be involved in the responding to the inquiries. So we hope that he's fortunate, we wish him well, and we wait to hear further developments. The soapbox we've had in several conferences. I've never known it fail, and it didn't fail today. This is a very quick, sharp way of getting somebody 90 seconds, and Paul Devlin used the gong to great effect. Nobody went over time or was allowed to do so. And 7 of our colleagues from the room, all volunteers, let fly with a number of very spirited and stimulating comments. There were people who wanted to argue for better contact for patients with CQC visits, people who wanted to develop an understanding of the population basis and the epidemiology of the people at risk. We had somebody campaigning for more defibrillators at about a couple of thousand a time. We had one group who got hold of 25,000, which took a breath from the rest of the audience, and we had a passionate advocacy for the need and development and support for carers. I think there's just one other thing I should say, which is, apart from what the speaker said, which is this is a time of most extraordinary change in general practice. Perhaps more change going on more quickly than any time since the Second World War. And there are now practices merging and amalgamating and forming into huge groups of 150, even 200,000 population. And I think there is one urgent need for patient participation groups, that if any of you find yourselves in such groups, and in such new practices and structures, I think it's very important you tell the trustees and give as much information as you can, because there's no experience of this. We simply don't know how this is going to work. It might release new resources for the PPG in these big groups, but there's a concern because previous research has shown that access and continuity in big groups is worse than in small groups. So really this needs urgent attention by PPGs, and your practices will be discussing this, and I think you need to have your eye very much on the ball of size. Size is the issue of 2016, what the NHS England likes to call operating at scale. And lastly, I think it's important, as your patron, I said, I still meet patient participation groups that are not affiliated to NAP, another one this year. And I think it is incumbent on all of you in your local communities to, when you make contact, particularly with other groups, to encourage them to affiliate, because NAP really needs as many groups as it can get, and we need all our expertise together in these very unsettled times. I want to spend just a moment or two talking about two reports. Because in April, that's only 7 weeks ago, there were two absolutely major reports issued, published on the same day in April, both of which have profound implications for the health service. They were both really important, and they came out on the same day. We've mentioned the first one, the 5-year forward view for general practice. I really think that any lively PPG should read it. It sets out a range of options. It commits huge resources, and I mean huge. It's talking about £2 billion a year, and it's proposing a raft of other professionals, more mental health nurses, more pharmacists, more assistant doctors, a whole variety. And that's a new concept that we haven't really had, and I think it needs urgent thought by PPGs as to how that's going to work and how that will be for patients. And I think, as I said before, that the result of that document is partly the result of NAP, because it was the lobbying that NAP with the college did that led to that change of thought in the government. And in Simon Stevens' striking phrase, general practice will no longer get the crumbs from the hospital table, but will be funded in its own right for the first time. The second report is the report of the Health Select Committee of Parliament. The so-called Wollaston report, because it's chaired by Dr. Sarah Wollaston, who's a GP in Devon, but who was, interestingly, for about 15 years, an experienced and very good GP herself. This report is publicly available, it's on the web, and it's absolutely stacked full of interesting facts and figures about the health service. But the big issues are, it painted up the huge reduction of resources for general practice. It has a striking table showing that for 8 years running, general practice got less than the year before. That GP incomes have fallen by 2.1% every year for 8 years, so it's not too surprising our GPs are a bit on the back foot. And it has made a whole raft of suggestions, particularly in medical education, one of which is to encourage medical students to come into general practice and to try to learn more about how good and important a role general practice is. And at the end, in paragraph 144, there's a very interesting comment which actually suggests that general practice should be taught in our medical schools as a subject in its own right. And every time I say this to people, people look blankly at me and say, do you mean it isn't? And the extraordinary fact is that it isn't. There is no course in my school in Exeter or in Plymouth next door on general practice as a subject with its own research and its own background. It's an extraordinary deficiency, and it's one of the reasons why 81% of medical students want to be specialists and not generalists, because they're not actually hearing how interesting and important general practice research is. So that's a firm recommendation. It will be rolling out in the coming year, because a lot of pressure is putting on that, and I think it will have implications for PPGs, and you may want to be asked to help with teaching, and indeed it would be wonderful if PPGs could actually get an opportunity to teach medical students about the sort of exciting thing we've heard from the two Corkhill winners a few minutes ago. I just want to finish by reporting to you that I wrote a letter to the Financial Times in February when I became increasingly concerned about the resourcing of the NHS, not its arrangements, but just how much money was available to the whole service. As you may know, I've got an interest in fact and figures, and I still do a lot of research. And two very unusual things happened to that letter, which I wrote as your patron and signed it as your patron. To the first time, I think, the National Association NAP has been in the Financial Times. The first was that most letters, when you write to the Times or the Financial Times, you never hear again, and your letter is binned. This one was different, and the FT came back to me saying they wanted to give it priority. They would give it the lead position on a Saturday, which was the biggest circulation, and the editor would give me an extra heading. And he changed my heading, strengthened it, and the letter came out as their heading, "We really are not spending enough on the NHS," and he gave it a really prominent position. That was the first unusual thing. Now, having been a consultant advisor to the Department of Health, I know how the department works, and they have teams of public relations staff who crawl over anything like that appears. And so I sat around waiting for a week or two to see how many ministers were going to descend on my head and tear my little letter to shreds. And incidentally, in passing, I strongly object to the size of those PR departments. In Devon and Cornwall alone, there's £1 million a year spent on PR by the health authority, combined health authorities, which I think is completely out of proportion. However, back to the story. The fascinating thing is in the Conan Doyle's famous words, "The dog did not bark, there was no reply." So that means that the ministers, the three health ministers, and all their advisors took a look at this letter and said, we don't want to get involved with this. They could not answer a brutal letter saying Britain is spending a third to a quarter less than all our leading continental countries. Britain has 20% fewer doctors than other countries. We have 15% fewer nurses. We have half the number of MRI scanners, and we are slowly and steadily falling behind the standards of care in the leading countries in Western Europe. A very uncomfortable conclusion, and I didn't enjoy writing it, but it's a message I think that needs to be said. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think we've had a great day. It's been a very good conference centre. I think the arrangements seem to have worked, and I've had comments on the acoustics being very much better than ever before. I think we should say a particular thank you to Edith Todd and Moira Akhtarlononi, who has in fact borne the brunt of making the arrangements on behalf of the trustees. I think we've had stimulating speakers, some of whom have given us material that some of us have never heard before. And I'd like to thank you as an audience for real audience participation, asking super questions, lovely soapbox, and I hope that you all have a very safe journey home.